Relax and listen to the voice. Here we are. Christmas time is right around the corner. Families getting together, spending quality time with one another, children running around the house, presents stacked to the roof. I'm not sure about other countries or even other realities, but we've always thought it was a strange practice that we allow a strange man to come down our chimneys into our homes, frolic around all night long. In fact, we even leave treats for him. There's no other time of year that this would be remotely acceptable or even allowed. The privacy that we have in our own homes is one thing that we all demand and require. Yet one night every year, we completely throw caution to the wind with that. Perhaps some more cautionary tales would be of good measure. And with that in mind, I would like to relay some popular Christmas tales. Ho, 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 ho. 'Twas the night before Christmas. 'Twas the night before Christmas, when all through the house not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse. The stockings were hung by the chimney with care, in hopes that St. Nicholas soon would be there. The children were nestled all snug in their beds, while visions of sugar plums danced in their heads. And Mama in her kerchief and I in my cap had just settled down for a long winter's nap. When out on the lawn there arose such a clatter, I sprang from my bed to see what was the matter. Away to the window I flew like a flash, tore open the shutters and threw up the sash. The moon on the breast of the new fallen snow gave the luster of midday to objects below, when what to my wondering eyes should appear but a miniature sleigh and 8 tiny reindeer, with a little old driver so lively and quick, I knew in a moment it must be St. Nick. More rapid than eagles his coursers they came, and he whistled and shouted and called them by name.
Now Dasher, now Dancer, now Prancer and Vixen, on Comet, on Cupid, on Donner and Blitzen, to the top of the porch, to the top of the wall, now dash away, dash away, dash away all.
As dry leaves that before the wild hurricane fly, when they meet with an obstacle, mount to the sky, so up to the housetop the coursers they flew, with the sleigh full of toys, and St. Nicholas too. And then in a twinkling I heard on the roof the prancing and pawing of each little hoof. As I drew in my head and was turning around, down the chimney St. Nicholas came with a bound. He was dressed in all fur from his head to his foot, and his clothes were all tarnished with ashes and soot. A bundle of toys he had flung on his back, and he looked like a peddler just opening his pack. His eyes, how they twinkled, his dimples, how merry. His cheeks were like roses, his nose like a cherry. His droll little mouth was drawn up like a bow, and the beard of his chin was as white as the snow. The stump of a pipe he held tight in his teeth, and the smoke had encircled his head like a wreath. He had a broad face and a little round belly that shook when he laughed like a bowl full of jelly. He was chubby and plump, a right jolly old elf, and I laughed when I saw him, in spite of myself. A wink of his eye and a twist of his head soon gave me to know I had nothing to dread. He spoke not a word, but went straight to his work, and filled all the stockings, then turned with a jerk, and laying his finger aside of his nose, and giving a nod, up the chimney he rose. He sprang to his sleigh, to his team gave a whistle, and away they all flew, like the down of a thistle. But I heard him exclaim, ere he drove out of sight,
Happy Christmas to all, and to all a good night.
Information about Krampus. Christmas has long been a celebration of joy, as Santa Claus rewards all the good boys and girls with presents and holiday cheer. Children who have not been so nice are said to receive a lump of coal in their stocking instead of a gift. However, many years ago, children received a visit from the Christmas devil, a consequence much more frightening than coal. The legend of the Krampus dates back centuries, originating as a German Christmas tradition during the 12th century. Beginning in early December, the children of Germany would begin to hear the whispers of a dark-haired creature bearing horns and fangs, carrying a bundle of birch sticks used to swat naughty children. According to traditional narratives of Alpine folklore, this Krampus would enter the towns, lashing his chains and bells, to capture the bad children in a basket and bring them down to the underworld. The Krampusnacht, meaning Krampus night, would occur the evening before December 6th, which is St. Nicholas's Day, when the nice German children were rewarded with presents in their boots. In the 21st century, many Alpine countries continue to celebrate the Krampusnacht with parades, where the townsmen dress like devils and run through the streets, chasing after children and naughty parents alike. More recently, the legend of Krampus has gained popularity in the United States of America, with Krampus festivals being held across the country in Los Angeles, Philadelphia, and New York City. The Krampuskarten, or vintage Krampus greeting cards, often depicted Krampus sneaking up on a child about to be punished. These cards often read, "Grüß von Krampus," or greetings from the Krampus. Krampus, whose name is derived from the German word Krampen, meaning claw, is a satyr-like figure of ancient folklore who has long terrorized Central Europe, accompanying Saint Nick on his travels and violently sifting the naughty children from the nice. He's often portrayed as a devil-like figure with black or brown hair covering his entire body, cloven hooves, goat-like horns, razor-sharp fangs, and a long, lolling tongue hanging from his mouth. For every good boy and girl that St. Nicholas rewards, there are dozens of others who don't make the cut, and they are left for Krampus to be whipped with a birch switch, or even stuffed into his sack and carried away to his lair to be tortured and eaten. His image has evolved over the years, getting less goat-like and more devilish, but his evil intentions have remained the same, providing the motivation children need to behave around the holidays and the punishment they deserve if they fail to do so. Many believe that the origin of Krampus predates Christianity, and there is no doubt that there are some interesting parallels between his lore and that of other pagan figures. But it isn't until St. Nicholas and his holiday that Krampus really started to make an impression. If we look back on the long history of Central European folklore, many of which contain harsh moral lessons for children, as can be noted in the Grimm's Fairy Tales collection, usually under the threat of unrestrained violence by horrific figures, it's not hard to understand how someone like Krampus came to be. With St. Nick starting to make his rounds every December 6th, bringing candy and dried fruits to all the good boys and girls, it's only natural that a balance should form. After all, the only thing more motivating than rewarding good deeds is punishing bad deeds. Just imagine this. It's Christmas Eve, and you've just finished watching a Christmas movie with your family, or singing Christmas carols by the fireside. You're settling down to sleep when suddenly, an enormous shaggy monster with horns bursts into your bedroom, dragging chains and ringing a bell. He attacks you and he beats you over the head with a stick while you scream for your parents to help you. Then, he stuffs you into his bag and kidnaps you as your parents stand by and do nothing. Finally, he throws you into a river and drowns you. All of this because you didn't behave yourself during the year. A couple of alleged eyewitness accounts follow. I am originally from Austria, and I spent many years as a child being chased around town by Krampus. It is one of the scariest experiences you can have as a child growing up in Austria. It's also one of the biggest adrenaline rushes because the danger is quite real. Once, Krampus saw my friends and I and began chasing us. We jumped fences and ran through backyards, and Krampus just kept coming after us. When he catches you, he usually gives you a pretty good whipping around your legs, and yes, it hurts. It's also really scary. I can never forget that terror as a child. Christoph. Nina says, I am Austrian and quite familiar with Krampus, since I got beaten by him several times in my childhood. Gavin says, my family lived in Germany when I was young. My siblings and I had the opportunity to meet Krampus every Christmas. It was truly terrifying as a kid. Krampus would come into our house, we were lined up, and he asked us questions about how good or bad we had been all year. Krampus had a big bag full of kids with legs and arms sticking out that would actually move around and whimper. Krampus would walk over and whack the bag with a whip. Oh, I tell you, we didn't want to end up in that bag. But as Krampus became entangled with St. Nick and Christianity in the Middle Ages, the holiday taking on more and more traditional dogma, the image of Krampus himself began to change, becoming less animalistic and more akin to the representations of the devil himself. Krampus's horns got longer, his face more human-like, and even his tongue began to hang low from his mouth, like the representations of Satan in the Bible. What once was a birch switch became a whip, and what was once his lair in the woods where he feasted on children became an eternity of damnation in hell itself. In fact, the more Krampus was tied into Christian dogma, and the more satanic he became, the less welcome he was at all the festivities. The superstitious people who once embraced him as a folk anti-hero started banning him completely from the holiday for fear of tempting the devil himself. Eventually, Krampus would fall off completely in the modern world, celebrated in only remote villages that still held on to the old ways. And as St. Nicholas Day evolved into Christmas and the holiday took on more of its kid-friendly lore and consumer traditions, Krampus would almost disappear completely. Almost. For many centuries, the legend of Krampus stayed within his boundaries, remembered in small corners of Europe, but otherwise unheard of in most of the world, America included. But in the past decade, there's been a resurgence of Krampus culture that has even made its way into the Western Hemisphere. Somehow, Krampus has made a comeback. Whether it's the response to the over-commercialization of Christmas, its descent into holly-jolly extremism, or just the planets aligning in ways we haven't seen since the days of the pagans, Krampus has now become a part of Christmas again. People around the world have returned to the old ways, dressing up in costumes, holding parades, handing out holiday cards, and doing everything they can to bring a little darkness back into a white Christmas that has long overstayed its welcome. And it all starts on Krampusnacht. In the past, Krampusnacht was a time for bedtime stories, basically a way to warn the excited children that they must behave one more night if they wish to be visited by St. Nicholas in the morning and not to be carried away in Krampus' sack to be tortured and eaten. Whether or not Krampus poses a threat to today's children, there's no doubt that his legend will live on, a reminder of a time when Christmas was more than just holiday cards, cookies and milk, and a jolly old man who brings joy to every boy and girl. In fact, as far as any of us can be concerned, the world could use a little more Krampus in it. Maybe we could toss in a little bit of Krampus into our normal Christmas stories for the children. So this holiday season, when someone greets you with Merry Christmas, feel free to respond with Merry Christmas to you, and may Krampus not take your child away in a basket. The Grither. It was Christmas Eve and the family were gathered in the living room. The father was reading the newspaper and the mother was knitting a sweater. The children, Jimbo and Steffa, were stretched out on the floor with their crayons and their coloring books. "Tell us a story," Steffa demanded. "Yes, a scary one," Jimbo insisted. "All right," said their father. "I'm going to tell you about the most fearsome, dangerous, and appalling creature in the world, and it's called The Grither. Oh, now you've done it, said their mother. You said his name out loud. Who is he? Asked Jimbo. He's the most awful thing in the world, their father said. He lives in a cave at the North Pole. The coldest, wettest place on Earth is where the Grither makes his home. He sleeps in the wreck of a ship that somehow got squeezed into the mouth of a cave. He doesn't mind the cold, and he doesn't mind the wet, but the thing he hates most of all is to hear somebody say his name. He has very good ears, and they get bigger every time his name is spoken anywhere on Earth. Sometimes his ears get so big, he can use them to fly. I don't like this story, Steffa whined. It's too late now, her mother said. We've already mentioned his name. The Grither is probably on his way to our house this very minute. It'll probably take him a while to get here, said their father. If we finish the story before it gets here, everything will be fine. Do you know why the Grither is called the Grither? Why? The children asked. Because he has fists as big as basketballs and arms as long as boa constrictors, said their father with a grin. Whenever he finds the people who have been speaking his name, he opens up his fist and reaches out his arms and he grithers them in. He grabs them by the head and squeezes them until they pop, just like a balloon. Does he look like Bigfoot? Jimbo asked. No, said Jimbo's father. He's not like Bigfoot, and he's not like the abominable snowman either. Nobody knows what he looks like for sure. The only people who've ever seen the Grither are the people that the Grither has eaten. He's as tall as a tree, but he can bend all the way over and touch the ground. His skin looks like a road map because it's transparent and all of his blue and red veins show through. The blue is for the fear, and the red is for his rage. Hurry up and finish the story. Hurry up and finish the story before he gets here, Steffa cried. The Grither was born on a sailing ship, said her father. It was blown off course by a storm and got lost in the Arctic Sea. He drifted around for weeks and never saw anything but glaciers and icebergs. Some of the passengers drowned, some of them froze to death, some starved, and the rest committed suicide. The Grither was born out of the fear and rage of all those people. But why does he kill people? Jimbo asked. Nobody knows, said his father. He just doesn't like anyone telling his story. Is that all? Steffa asked. Is that the end of the story? Not quite. There's only one way to protect yourself from the Grither, said her father. Maybe you should stop, their mother interrupted. I think you've scared them enough. The father chuckled. You don't believe in the Grither, do you? He asked the children. No, the children both said, but they were lying. Well, you shouldn't, their father said, because I made it all up. There's no such thing as the Grither. But you didn't finish the story, Steffa whined. All of a sudden, the front door blew open, and the room was enveloped in an icy blast of wind. There was a crash and the sound of breaking glass. Then two huge, gnarled arms reached in through the windows and grasped their parents by their heads. As the children watched in horror, the hands squeezed and squeezed, and their parents' heads popped, just like two balloons. The Carol Singers. My grandfather was a drunk, and my father was a drunk, but I never touched a drop. There's a reason for that. When I was young, times were hard and I grew up very poor. My grandfather and my father never did an honest day's work in their lives. Granddad wasn't good for much, but he played the clarinet like an artist. He taught my father how to play the accordion. Every Christmas, they would gather a group of their friends and go from door to door, playing Christmas music, singing Christmas carols, and begging for money. Afterwards, they would all go down to the pub and spend it all on alcohol. One Christmas Eve, they brought me with them. I was too young to play an instrument, so they handed me a triangle and told me to strike it every now and then. That night was dark, the snow was falling, and a cold December wind cut through us like a knife. We kept our heads down and trudged through the snow and the sleet. Eventually, my grandfather stopped and said, "This looks like as good a place as any." We were outside of a big mansion, decorated with Christmas lights. My grandfather knocked on the front door and we began to play some old Christmas carols. The door of the house swung open, and in the dim light I saw a young woman standing there. She was holding a tray of glasses in her hands. With a smile, she picked up a glass and held it out, inviting one of the men to drink. My grandfather rubbed his hands together excitedly and took the glass. Just then, I looked up, and in the window above, I saw a face peering out of the shadows, a face that was hideous beyond words. I looked back at the woman in the doorway, and her face was hideous too. Before I could stop him, my grandfather put the glass to his lips and knocked it back with one big gulp. "Oh dear," said the woman in an eerie, childish voice. "You've drunk blood, sir." With that, the door slammed shut. My grandfather stumbled backwards and the glass fell from his hands. It shattered with a deafening crash and he collapsed in the snow. I don't remember much after that. All I recall is waking up in the light of dawn and finding myself lying in the snow. The other men were lying all around me, just waking up themselves. My father got to his feet and rubbed his head. The woman had disappeared and the house was boarded up and abandoned. All that was left was a dark red stain in the snow where the glass had broken. My grandfather lay there in the snow beside it, his face all purple and swollen. He was as dead as a doornail. We hurried home that morning and called the police. They picked up my grandfather's body and brought it to the mortuary. My father told them what had happened, but they didn't believe a word of his tale. They said that house had been vacant for over 100 years. After that night, my father was never the same man again. He never let another drop of alcohol touch his lips, and he made sure I did the same. The Sock Puppet. Many years ago in Ireland, there was a wealthy man who lived in a small village. He owned every single plot of land surrounding the village and rented them out to poor farmers at a tidy profit. The man lived in the biggest house in the village with his lovely wife, his 2 strong sons, and his small, sickly daughter. He was kind to all of his children and treated his wife like a queen. However, in business, he was ruthless and cunning. He made a lot of money by charging the villagers high rents and treated all of his tenants as if they were slaves. If any one of them was behind with their rent, he would throw them out of their houses without a moment's notice. The villagers hated the rich man and despised his cruel and miserly ways. He often threw lavish parties, inviting only his friends and family, and living like a king, while the poor villagers had to scrimp and save just to keep their bellies full. All they could afford was a meager diet of bread and potatoes. One year there was a potato blight, and all the crops were affected. As winter set in, the villagers were starving to death. The rich man paid no attention to the troubles of his tenants and responded by raising the rents. Then, as if that wasn't enough, he threw a Christmas party for his friends and family, where they enjoyed an enormous feast and drank sarcastic toasts to the plight of the starving tenants. That night, one villager arrived at the door bearing a gift. He said it was a Christmas present for the rich man's daughter. The girl opened the present and found a sock puppet inside. The villager said he had knitted it himself, and he had asked if he might have some food in return. The rich man handed the villager one single solitary potato and sent him on his way. Although it was a hideous old rag, the daughter seemed to love the sock puppet. She named it Charlie and put it on her hand, showing it to everyone at the party. That night, after the party was over, the father was going to bed. He paused at his daughter's bedroom door and looked in on her. She was fast asleep. Just as he was about to leave, something disturbed him. The sock puppet was still on her hand, and its plastic eyes seemed to be staring straight at him. He ignored it and walked out, thinking he was just imagining things. That night, as the rich landlord and his wife slept in their chamber, they heard a knock at the door. It was their daughter. "Mama, Papa, Charlie says he needs to speak with you," said she. They saw their daughter walk in, blood dripping from one hand and the sock puppet on the other, staring at them both. "Charlie already spoke with Jacob and Michael," said the daughter, moving the sock puppet's mouth as if it was speaking. "Now he must speak with you." For weeks, the rich man's house lay eerily silent. The villagers saw no candles in the windows and no smoke from the chimney. Eventually, they decided to check on the family, and what they discovered shocked everyone to their very core. In the living room sat the two brothers. Both strong young men had their heads twisted off and placed on their hands as if the heads were puppets. The same had happened to the parents, who were found dead and decaying in their beds. The most disturbing sight of all was the little girl. She was sitting in the corner of the bedroom, her severed head balanced upon one hand, smiling sweetly with her eyes wide open. On the other hand was the sock puppet. Due to the rigor mortis, her arms were sticking out, and it seemed as if the two hands were speaking to each other. Just recently, another family has moved into the house. They moved to the country because the family doctor said it might help their sick daughter to recover from her illness. Everything was fine until one night, when the mother heard the daughter calling out to her. Before the mother opened the door, she heard her daughter talking. She peeked in and the girl was fast asleep. "What did she need, honey?" asked the father when his wife returned. The mother paused before speaking. "I have no idea. The poor little thing must have been talking in her sleep. Do you know where she got that awful sock puppet? She was wearing it on her hand, and it almost seemed like it was staring straight at me." Black Peter. Sinterklaas is the Dutch and Belgian version of Santa Claus. He is also known as Sint Nicolaas. According to legend, he triumphed over a devilish dwarf called Zwarte Piet, or Black Peter, and he made him his slave. Black Peter lives in a coal mine in Spain. His skin is black because of the soot and coal dust from the mine. His hair is singed by the fire from all the chimneys he has to climb down. He spends the year spying on the children of Belgium and Holland, taking note of who's been good and who's been wicked. On Christmas Eve, he sets out from his coal mine, squeezing himself through the narrow tunnels and riding off on his coal cart, which is pulled by plague-ridden undead rams. Every Christmas, Black Peter is forced to accompany Santa Claus as he goes from house to house, distributing his presents. While Santa rewards the good children, Black Peter takes delight in punishing the bad ones. Children who misbehave do not receive any presents from Santa. Instead, Black Peter will leave a bundle of twigs or a lump of coal in their Christmas stocking as a warning. If the children have been really bad, or have not heeded his warning, Black Peter will snatch them from their beds and throw them into his sack, which is full of hungry rats. He kidnaps the boys and girls and takes them back to his coal mine, where he chains them up and makes them his slaves. The poor children are forced to dig coal forever, while Black Peter amuses himself by poking them with sharp pins. If they ever grow too sick or tired to work, Black Peter will eat them. Trapp. When Christmas approaches, naughty children in Alsace and Lorraine tremble when their parents utter the words, "Hans Trapp is coming." Everyone knows the tale of Santa's evil counterpart. According to the legend, during the 15th century, There was a rich and powerful man who lived in the heart of Alsace. His name was Hans Trapp. The people of Alsace knew him to be vain, cunning, heartless, and cruel. His life was given over to lawlessness and debauchery, and his only goal was to enrich himself by all means necessary. It was said that he worshipped Satan and could use black magic and occult rituals to obtain his wealth and hold on to his power. When the Catholic Church became aware of these misdeeds, Hans Trapp was arrested and brought before the Pope in Rome. He was excommunicated from the church for the crime of sacrilege. When he returned to Alsace, he was ostracized by the local people. Everyone fled from him as if he was a wild beast. His money and land were confiscated, and he was left penniless. They say he was forced into exile in the forest and isolated himself from the rest of society. He found shelter on the mountain of Geisberg in Bavaria, Germany, where he built himself a makeshift shack made from sticks. The solitude caused him to lose his mind, and he spent his days brooding and dreaming of revenge. His anger and resentment were intensified, and he became more deeply devoted to Satanism. Descending into madness, Hans Trapp began to dream of eating human flesh. The evil man was obsessed with the desire to bite into the flesh of a human arm, leg, or thigh. He roamed the countryside and disguised himself as a scarecrow by stuffing his ragged clothes with straw. He spent his time gathering sticks and hay in fields and lying in wait, looking for the perfect victim. One day, he spotted a young shepherd boy making his way through the woods. The boy was only 10 years of age, but Hans Trapp was determined to kill and eat him. As he stared at the young boy, he began to drool at the mouth, imagining biting into his delicious and tender flesh. Before the boy knew what was happening, Hans Trapp pounced on him, attacking him viciously and running him through with a sharpened stick. He dragged the dying child back to his shack, where he cut the boy into small pieces and roasted them over an open fire. When his monstrous meal was ready, Hans Trapp licked his lips and prepared to taste human flesh for the first time. However, before a morsel could enter his mouth, a bolt of lightning came from the sky and struck him dead. As the story goes, God would not allow the abomination to continue and decided to end the crimes of Hans Trapp once and for all. Since that time, Hans Trapp has remained a terrifying legend in the folklore of Alsace and Lorraine. Every Christmas, he goes from house to house, clad in his scarecrow disguise, scaring the life out of the small children and drooling greedily over their tender flesh. Christmas monsters. Every country has different customs during the Christmas season. Some of these customs have their roots in ancient pagan beliefs. Christmas monsters are used by the parents to keep children in line. If they don't behave themselves, they won't get any Christmas gifts, and they might get terrifying results from the monsters. Here's a list of the scariest Christmas monsters from folklore around the world. As previously discussed, Krampus. Krampus is the evil demon anti-Santa, or maybe his evil twin, who's used as a tool to encourage good behavior in children. Krampus Night is celebrated on December 5th, the eve of St. Nicholas's Day in Austria and other parts of Europe. Public celebrations that night have many Krampuses walking the streets, looking for people to beat with sticks. Krampus may look like a devil or a wild alpine beast. Frau Persta. Tales told in Germany and Austria sometimes feature a witch named Frau Persta, who hands out both rewards and punishments during the 12 days of Christmas, which is December 25th through Epiphany on January 6th. She is best known for her gruesome punishment of the sinful, where she will rip out your internal organs and replace them with garbage. The ugly image of Frau Persta may show up in Christmas processions in Austria, somewhat like Krampus does. Jólakaturin. Jólakaturin is the Icelandic Yule cat, or Christmas cat. He is not a nice cat. In fact, he might eat you. This character is tied to an Icelandic tradition in which those who finished all their work on time received new clothes for Christmas, while those who were lazy did not, although this is mainly just a threat. To encourage children to work hard, parents told the tale of the Yule cat, saying that Jólakaturin could tell who the lazy children were because they did not have at least one new item of clothing for Christmas, and these children could be sacrificed to the Yule cat. Joulupukki. In Finland, they have Joulupukki, who is similar to Krampus. He has horns and hooves like some kind of demonic goat, and he loves to beat naughty children with a tree branch until their backsides are bleeding. He comes to your house and asks, "Are there any good children here?" He doesn't bother giving out presents. Instead, you have to give him presents to avoid a beating. The Yule Lads. The Yule Lads are 13 Icelandic trolls who each have a name and a distinct personality. In ancient times, they stole things and caused trouble around Christmas time, so they were used to scare children into behaving, similar to the Yule cat was. The 13 Yule Lads were named Sheepcoat Claude. Sheepcoat Claude is the one who tries to suckle at ewes on sheep farms. Gully Gawk. Let Claude go to the sheep because he was more preoccupied with the cows. He likes to hide in the cow stalls and steal the milk. Stubby is known for being a bit shorter than the others, and he likes to steal food from frying pans. Potlicker, as you can assume based on the name, likes to lick pots. Bowl Licker has a similar inclination, but for bowls instead of pots. Door Slammer slams all the doors for the sole purpose of keeping everyone awake. Skyr Gobbler, the 8th Yule Lad, likes to eat all the yogurt, which is called skyr in Icelandic. Sausage Swiper swipes all the sausages. Window Peeper likes to creep outside the villagers' homes and spy on the world inside, sometimes with the intention of stealing some of the things that he sees. Door Sniffer has a huge nose and loves to steal various baked goods. Meat Hook steals the meat left out and has a special love for smoked lamb. The last Yule Lad, Candlebagger, steals candles, which were once a highly sought-after item. Grilla. All of the Yule Lads answer to Grilla, their mother. She predates the Yule Lads in Icelandic legend as the ogress who kidnaps, cooks, and eats children who don't obey their parents. She only became associated with Christmas around the 17th century when she was assigned to be the mother of the Yule Lads. According to legend, Grilla has had 3 different husbands and 72 children, all who cause trouble, ranging from harmless mischief to murder. Hans Trapp. As previously discussed, Hans Trapp is another anti-Santa who hands out punishment to bad children in the Alsace and Lorraine regions of France. The legend says that Hans Trapp was a real man, a rich, greedy, and evil man who worshipped Satan and was excommunicated from the Catholic Church. He was exiled into the forest where he preyed upon children, disguised as a scarecrow with straw jetting out from his clothing. He was about to eat one boy he captured when he was struck by lightning and killed, which was a punishment of his own from God. Still, he visits young children before Christmas, dressed as a scarecrow, to scare them into good behavior. The Bloody Axe. I remember that Christmas when I was 8 years old, as if it had happened yesterday. I remember how I would lie very still under the old moth-eaten quilt my mother made. I was wide awake and listening for those familiar sounds. the thump of the front door closing, the clomp, clomp, clomp of my father's mud-caked boots on the stairs, and the sound that to this day still fills me with revulsion and horror. Drip, drip, drip. Then my father would pass by my doorway, and the light from the hallway would cast a shadow on my bedroom wall, and the shadow of the bloody axe he carried in his hands. The next morning, I would eat my watery oatmeal in the wintry chill of our kitchen and ask my mother, very slowly and carefully, "Where was Daddy last night?" She would just look at me with her sad gray eyes. I will never forget the pain and torment in those eyes, but she never said a single word. After my breakfast, I would set about doing the chores on our little farm. My father never did much work on the farm. He always seemed to be busy with other matters. On those chilly, windy mornings, as the snow began to fall, I had a lot of time to think. At school, I couldn't pay much attention to my lessons. I was always lost in my own troubling thoughts. When I got home in the evening, I would just arrive in time to see my father leaving, his axe clutched tightly in his hands. I rarely saw my father during daylight hours, and at night, all I ever saw was his shadow. I can still vividly recall that terrible night when I was awakened by the sound of the shutters on my bedroom window clattering in the screaming December winds. When I got up to close the shutters, I happened to glance over at the barn, and I noticed a shadow in the darkness. It was my father, and he was putting something into the feed box we used for the cattle. I returned to bed and lay awake long into the night, puzzled by just what I had seen. Eventually, I fell into a tortured and troubled sleep. The next day, my curiosity got the better of me. I took that key that hung on the hook in the kitchen, and I opened up the feed box. I remember standing and staring for several seconds at the foul-smelling, bloody pulp inside, trying to understand why my father would put parts of a slaughtered animal into the feed box. Then I noticed something that struck horror into the pit of my soul. Jutting up out of the bloody offal was a severed human hand. From that moment, I was filled with a nameless dread. I no longer looked at my parents with trust, but with a dark, creeping suspicion. I began to notice things that had previously escaped my attention. Newspaper headlines that spoke about brutal murders and discovered bodies. Overheard conversations about a bloodthirsty fiend on the loose. Finally, I heard a boy at school utter two words that repeated over and over in my tortured mind. Axe murderer. That night my sleep was invaded by shapeless horrors. In these nightmares I saw two images that haunted me constantly. The face of my father and an axe dripping with blood. Unable to sleep, I got out of bed and crept downstairs. Taking my father's axe from the fireplace, I dimmed the lights and crouched in the darkness at the top of the stairs. It seemed like an eternity before I heard the key in the lock and the front door swing open and then close. There was that thump. I listened to those familiar footsteps on the stairs. Clomp, clomp, clomp. Stepping out of the darkness, I raised the axe above my head and brought it crashing down. In the eerie silence that followed, I listened for the sound of any movement from my parents' bedroom. I hoped against hope that my mother had heard nothing. The only sound I heard was the creaking of the floorboards beneath my feet and the pounding of my own heart. I looked for the last time at the headless body that lay crumpled at the bottom of the stairs, and then I quietly tiptoed back to my bed. Sometime early in the next morning, I was awakened by the sound of strange voices in our hallway. Silently, I crept to the top of the stairs and peered down at the scene below. A group of policemen were crowded around my father's bloody corpse. My mother was standing beside them, watching silently. No one was paying any attention, but when she glanced up, she noticed me. Then she very, very briefly and very discreetly gave me a knowing wink. Clarice. Gone. Ah, God, 4 letters only. 1 word, 1 thought, 1 breath of air. Yet all of life to one who hungers, one who clings to night's despair. Gone she is, this black December, as December's past compare. And my soul gone out there with her, through all the snows of yesteryear. Still she stands aglow before me, pale and tender, warm and rare. Still she runs through meadows laughing, locked in memory, slumber's snare. We share then the raindrops' laughter, we join then in springtime's flare. We embrace the summer's glory, we steal kisses on autumn's dares. Till the evenings come too quickly, and the stars hang cold and stare, and she trembles like a flower, under snow the winter shares. And those snows take once more from me, my whole life, my single heir, to face this cabin's chill awakening, begging God in drunken prayer. Why I come here every season, driven by the ghost of dread, I cannot in truth you answer, lest 'tis guilt I'm blindly led. To these oaken walls I stumble, nightmares clutch in vain to shed, while within the fireplace dances flames of things we did and said. I recall now, etched forever, on my mind be reverie fed. Together here near those same andirons, toasting Yuletide's nodding head. Me, the fool of wine's gay prison, she still light in firelight's red, sought the bitter night for firewood, for we sank to Christmas bed. I never heard the door behind her, blow tight shut in frame of lead, or her rapping, or her pounding, I was to the world one dead. How she suffered, agonizing, how her scraping fingers bled, how she screamed my name in terror, I'll relive in years ahead. Will my brain someday diminish? Sight reluctant eyes must show, beckoning still on frozen doorstep, screaming silent with the crow. There my wits from me departed, madness came with icy blows, as she reached with clutching talons for a warmth she would never know. On a field of desolation, beneath ice-covered limbs that bow, there I lay her silent figure, while the sun sank ever low. And all night I heard her screaming, all next day the pounding flow of her fist against the oak wood, phantom claws that won't let go. Oh, I'd give my life's soul gladly, all years left me, just to see one short glimpse of my beloved, to have now what used to be, to hold in arms decayed with wanting, that fragile form once a part of me, and feel those amber eyes that beckon, to sanity's door they hold the key. If I could believe she hears me, knows my anguish, feels my pain, I'd leave this mortal husk forever, and let her wandering spirit claim, to see her stand once more before me, to know her touch while I yet live, to hear her tender voice console me, beloved husband, I forgive. A Strange Christmas Game. It was the middle of November when we arrived at Martindale and found the place anything but romantic or pleasant. The walks were wet and sodden, the trees were leafless, there were no flowers save a few late pink roses blooming in the garden. It had been a wet season, and the place looked miserable. Claire would not ask Alice down to keep her company in the winter months, as she had intended, and for myself, The Cronsons were still absent in New Norfolk, where they meant to spend Christmas with old Mrs. Cronson, now recovered. Altogether, Martindale seemed dreary enough, and the ghost stories we laughed at while sunshine flooded the room became less unreal when we had nothing but blazing fires and wax candles to dispel the gloom. They became more real also when servant after servant left us to seek situations elsewhere, when noises grew frequent in the house, when we ourselves, Claire and I, with our own ears heard the tramp-tramp and the banging and the chattering which had been described to us. My dear reader, you doubtless are free from superstitious fancies. You pooh-pooh the existence of ghosts, and only wish that you could find a haunted house in which to spend a night just to see. Well, that's all very brave and praiseworthy, but wait until you're left in a dreary, desolate old country mansion, filled with the most unaccountable sounds, without a servant, with none save an old caretaker and his wife, who, living at the extremest end of the building, hear nothing of the tramp-tramp, the bang-bang, and the goings-on at all hours of the night. At first I imagined the noises were produced by some evil-disposed persons who wished, for purposes of their own, to keep the house uninhibited, but by degrees Claire and I came to the conclusion that the visitation must be supernatural, and that Martindale, by consequence, untenable. Still, being practical people, unlike our predecessors, not having money to live where and how we liked, we decided to watch and see whether we could trace any human influence in the matter. If not, it was agreed we were to pull down the right wing of the house and the principal staircase. For nights and nights we sat up until 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. Claire engaged in needlework, and I engaged in reading, with a revolver lying on the table beside me. But nothing, neither sound nor appearance, rewarded our vigils. This confirmed my first ideas that the sounds were not supernatural, but just to test the matter, I determined that on Christmas Eve, the anniversary of Mr. Jeremy Lester's disappearance, I would keep watch myself in the red bedchamber. Even to Claire, I never mentioned my intentions. About 10 p.m., tired out with our previous vigils, we each retired to rest. Somewhat ostentatiously, perhaps, I noisily shut the door of my room, and when I opened it half an hour afterwards, no mouse could have pursued its way along the corridor with greater silence and caution than myself. Quite in the dark, I sat in the red room. For over an hour, I might as well have been in my grave, for anything I could see in the apartment. But at the end of that time, the moon rose and cast strange lights across the floor and upon the wall of the haunted chamber. I kept my watch opposite the window. Now I changed my place to a corner near the door, where I was shaded from observation by the heavy hangings of the bed and the antique wardrobe. Still I sat on, but no sound broke the silence. I was weary with many nights of watching, and I was tired of my solitary vigil. I dropped at last into a slumber from which I awakened by hearing the door softly opened. "John," said my sister, almost in a whisper. "John, are you here?" "Yes, Claire," I answered. "But what are you doing up at this hour?" "Come downstairs," she replied. "They're in the oak parlor." I did not need any explanation as to whom she meant, but I crept downstairs after her, warned by an uplifted hand of the necessity for silence and caution. By the open door of the oak parlor, she paused, and we both looked in. There was the room we left in darkness overnight, with a bright wood fire blazing on the hearth, candles on the chimney-piece, the small table pulled out from its accustomed corner, and 2 men seated beside it, playing at cribbage. We could see the face of the younger player. It was that of a man about 25, of a man who had lived hard and wickedly, who had wasted his substance and his health, who had been, while in the flesh, Jeremy Lester. It would be difficult for me to say how I knew this, how in a moment I identified the features of the player with those of the man who had been missing for 41 years. Yeah, 41 years, that very night.
He was dressed in the costume of a bygone period. His hair was powdered, and around his wrists were the ruffles of lace. He looked like one who, having come from some great party, had sat down after his return home to play cards with an intimate friend. On his little finger there sparkled a ring, and the front of his shirt there gleamed a valuable diamond. There were diamond buckles on his shoes, and according to the fashion of this time, he wore knee breeches and silk stockings, which showed off advantageously the shapes of remarkably good leg and ankle. He sat opposite the door, but never once lifted his eyes to it. His attention seemed concentrated on the cards. For a time there was utter silence in the room, broken only by the momentous counting of the game. In the doorway we stood, holding our breath, terrified and yet fascinated by the scene which was being acted out before us. The ashes dropped on the hearth softly, and like the snow. We could hear the rustle of the cards as they were dealt out and fell upon the table. We listened to the count at 15-2, 15-4, and so forth, but there were no other words spoken until at length the player, whose face we could not see, exclaimed, "I win! The game is mine!" Then his opponent took up the cards, sorted them over negligently in his hand, put them close together, and flung the whole pack in his guest's face, exclaiming, "Cheat! Liar! Take that!" There was a bustle and confusion, a flinging over of chairs, and fierce gesticulation, and such a noise of passionate voices mingling that we could not hear a sentence which was uttered. All at once, however, Jeremy Lester strode out of the room in so great a hurry that he almost touched us where we stood. Out of the room, and tramp, 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 up the staircase, to the Red Room, whence he descended in a few minutes with a couple of rapiers under his arm. When he re-entered the room, he gave, as it seemed to us, the other man his choice of weapons, and then he flung open the window, and after ceremoniously giving place for his opponent to pass out first, he walked forth into the night, Claire and I following. We went through the garden and down a narrow winding walk to a smooth piece of turf, sheltered from the north by a plantation of young fir trees. It was a bright moonlit night by this time, and we could distinctly see Jeremy Lester measuring off the ground. "When you say 3, he said to the last man, whose back was still towards us. They had drawn lots for the ground, and the lot had fallen against Mr. Lester. He stood thus with the moonbeams falling upon him, and a handsomer fellow I would never desire to behold. 1, began the other, 2, and before our kinsman had the slightest suspicion of his design, he was upon him, and his rapier through Jeremy Lester's breast. At the sight of that cowardly treachery, Claire screamed aloud. In a moment, the combatants had disappeared. The moon was obscured behind a cloud, and we were standing in the shadow of the fir plantation, shivering with cold and terror. But we knew at last what had become of the late owner of Martindale, that he had not fallen, no, not in a fair fight, but foully murdered by a false friend. When late on Christmas morning I awoke, it was to see a white world, to behold the ground and trees and shrubs all laden and covered with snow. There was snow everywhere, such snow as no person could remember having fallen for 41 years. "It was on just such a Christmas as this that Mr. Jeremy disappeared," remarked the old sexton to my sister, who had insisted on dragging me through the snow to church, whereupon Claire fainted away and was carried into the vestry, where I made a full confession to the vicar of all we had beheld the previous night. At first, that worthy individual rather inclined to treat the matter lightly, but when a fortnight after, the snow melted away and the fir plantation came to be examined, he confessed that there might be more things in heaven and earth than his limited philosophy had dreamed of. In a little dear space, just within the plantation, Jeremy Lester's body was found. We knew it by the ring and the diamond buckles and the sparkling breastpin, and Mr. Cronson, who in his capacity as magistrate came over to inspect these relics, was visibly perturbed at my narrative. "Pray, Mr. Lester, did you in your dream see the face of the gentleman, your kinsman's opponent?" "No," I answered. He sat and stood with his back to us all the time.
"But there was nothing more, of course, to be done in the matter,"
observed Mr. Cronson. Nothing? I replied. And there the affair would doubtless have terminated, but that a few days afterward, when we were dining at Cronson Park, Claire all of a sudden dropped the glass of water she was carrying to her lips and exclaimed, "Look, John, there he is!" She rose from her seat, and with a face as white as a tablecloth, pointed to a portrait hanging on the wall. "I saw him for an instant when he turned his head towards the door as Jeremy Lester left it," she explained. "That is he." Of what followed after this identification, I have only the vaguest recollection. Servants rushed hither and thither. Mrs. Cronson dropped off her chair into hysterics. The young ladies gathered round their mamma. Mr. Cronson, trembling like one in an ague fit, attempted some kind of explanation, while Claire kept praying to be taken away. I took her away, not merely from Cronson Park, but from Martindale. Before we left the latter place, however, I had an interview with Mr. Cronson, who said the portrait that Claire had identified was that of his wife's father, the last person who saw Jeremy Lester alive. "He's an old man now," finished Mr. Cronson, "a man of over 80, who has confessed everything to me. You won't bring further sorrow and disgrace upon us by making this matter public?" I promised him I would keep silence, but the story gradually oozed out, and the Cronsons left the country. My sister never returned to Martindale. She married, and she's living in London. Though I assure her there are no strange noises in my house, she will not visit Bedfordshire, where the little girl she wanted me so long ago to think of seriously is now my wife and the mother of my children.
Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. There were many reindeer at the North Pole, where Santa Claus lived. To deliver toys and gifts to children on Christmas Eve, he chose the 8 of the best reindeers to pull his sleigh. His team of reindeers included Dasher, Dancer, Prancer, Vixen, Comet, Cupid, Donner, and Blitzen. Santa Claus fed them magical oats and corn so that they could fly high and fast. Santa divided his reindeers into 2 smaller groups, one with male reindeers and the other with female reindeers. Each reindeer had a different personality and interest. Santa Claus had another little reindeer named Rudolph, the son of Donner and Blitzen. Rudolph had a big, bright red nose, and it was not a regular nose at all. Other reindeers laughed at Rudolph, called him names, and never let him join their fun and games. That made Rudolph very lonely and sad. One day before Christmas, Rudolph went to Santa Claus and asked if he could be on the sleigh team. Santa loved Rudolph very much, but pulling the sleigh all over the world was a very hard job, so he advised the little reindeer to stay at home and wait until he grew up. Overhearing this story, the other reindeers giggled a lot and kept making fun of Rudolph. They said that children would scream and cry if they saw his bright red nose glowing. Hearing this, Rudolph became shy. He hid his unique nose in shame and walked back to his home. On Christmas Eve, a huge snowstorm hit just 1 hour before Santa Claus set off. The sky turned dark, the wind blew strongly, and the weather became very foggy. What would happen to Christmas? Santa was quite worried. He was afraid that he couldn't deliver the Christmas gifts to the children in such bad weather. Santa called on his sleigh team to set off early, but it was so dark that he couldn't see the road. The sleigh got stuck in the trees and then hit the rocks. Christmas could be canceled because of the storm, and if it happened, the children would be disappointed. Santa suddenly remembered Rudolph with his bright, shiny nose. He thought that the nose was so bright that it could act as a strong light to guide him on his sleigh. Santa ran to Rudolph and woke him up. The little reindeer was very surprised and also delighted when he saw Santa. His nose even glowed more brightly than usual.
Santa asked him to lead the other reindeers pulling his sleigh. Then, Rudolph led the sleigh team on that dark night through the harsh wind and thick fog, but the brave little reindeer still tried his best to fly fast. The other reindeer followed Rudolph's big shiny nose to stay on track. Admiring Rudolph's bravery, they also tried their best to fly faster. As the sun rose and the fog began to melt away, Santa had already delivered all the Christmas toys to the children all over the world. Santa and the sleigh team were warmly welcomed by everyone when they arrived back home at the North Pole. Christmas was saved, and Rudolph was the hero of the day. Santa Claus presented Rudolph with a Medal of Honor for his bravery. He became the youngest and bravest reindeer to ever join Santa's sleigh team. From then on, everybody loved Rudolph. The other reindeers never laughed at him and called him funny names again, and Rudolph became very proud of his bright red nose.
Thank you all for joining us once again. Thank you for spending your holidays with us as well. We hope, regardless of your practices or your beliefs, that you have happy holidays filled with equal amounts of joy and creepiness. We bid you farewell. Until next time, sweet dreams.